It is great to see you, so many friends and family and in-laws and outlaws and everybody. It's good to be together. It's good to have a place here to belong. Over the last few meetings, we have been asking the question, who would you say Jesus is? If your next door neighbor was to ask you who Jesus was or who Jesus is, what would you say? How would you answer? A couple of weeks ago, we began with a short video that told us the story of the disciples when they were taken by Jesus out to Caesarea Philippi, a city of pagan idols, a city where there were monument after monument to false gods, temple after temple to Roman and Greek gods, a place of absolute evil according to the Jewish people. And Jesus takes his closest followers there, and it is there that he asks them who people say he is. And they answer this and that. Great people, great prophets. But then he says, what about you? Mark 8:29-33 says, what about you? What are you saying about me? Who am I? And Peter gives the answer. The golden child, the top of the class. You are the Christ, the Messiah. And Jesus is like, yeah, okay, but keep it quiet. Don't breathe a word of it to anybody. And he began to explain things to them. It is necessary that the Son of Man proceed to an ordeal of suffering, to be tried and found guilty by the elders, high priests, the religious scholars, to be killed, and after 3 days raise up alive. He said this simply and clearly so that they couldn't miss it. But you know what? They missed it, didn't they? So remember the scriptures Rebecca read for us before. The women go to the tomb and they remembered being told this. But when they go back and they tell the guys, the male disciples, they didn't believe them. And so they go running back to the tomb and they see Peter, the same guy who says, you are the Christ, the Messiah. Peter goes all the way back there and he sees it's empty. And he goes away shaking and scratching his head. He doesn't understand. Jesus calls himself a number of things in Scripture. And in this story, I'm curious about what Jesus says about himself. We've had a look at what a blind man in Jericho said about Jesus and what he thought and who he thought Jesus was. We had a look at what the people on the crowds of people next to the roads welcoming Jesus into Jerusalem, we had a look at what they said. On Friday, we had a look at what Claudia, the wife of Pilate, the governor of the Roman district of Jerusalem, what she said. We had a look at what the thief hanging on the cross next to Jesus said about Jesus when he said, remember me. Which is extraordinary, isn't it? Because Jesus is hanging on a cross. Remember me has an incredible amount of faith in that one statement. But what does Jesus say about himself? Well, I played that short video to give us an overview of scriptural prophecy. Because Jesus, in this text, says, the Son of Man must proceed to an ordeal of Son of Man. When I was a kid, or when I was growing up in church, because I grew up in church, and they'd say this phrase, Son of Man, and I thought it just was a phrase that they used to highlight the fact that Jesus was human. And that's okay, because Jesus was human, but it's not about that. It's partially about that, because in Genesis 3:15, we read the origins of this prophecy where God says to the woman, there will be enmity between your offspring and hers. He'll wound your head. This is God talking to the serpent. He'll wound your head and you'll wound his heel. And from this text comes this prophecy and this understanding over millennia. This is at least 2,000 years before Christ is born. Jesus calls himself this Son of Man. the son from Eve who will be bitten on the heel, but at the same time will destroy the head of the serpent, or the snake now, because he's had his legs taken away. This serpent, the snake that is crushing humanity. It's not the only time Jesus claimed to be the Son of Man. I think the most dramatic time is Jesus has just been arrested, and he gets put on trial, right? Because, we believe in justice, so he had to have a trial. So he gets hauled in before the chief priests of the religious leaders, and they charge him with being a heretic, of claiming to be God. And they're asking him questions, and then they come to this point in Mark chapter 14. The chief priests tried again, this time asking, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed?" Meaning the Son of God. And Jesus said, "Yes, I am, and you'll see it yourself, the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the Mighty One, arriving on the clouds of heaven." Now that phrase, skip down to Daniel. All right, see, Daniel, 500-600 years before Christ, has heard this prophecy. And it forms part of his vision when he sees heaven. And he looks up and he sees heaven and he says, "Oh, I saw a human form, a son of man, arriving in a whirl of clouds. He came to the old one," meaning God, "and was presented to him. He was given power to rule, all the glory of royalty. Everyone had to serve him. His rule will be forever, never ending. His kingly rule will never be replaced." So, of course, when Jesus says those few lines in front of the priests, they get cranky. He has just proven and sentenced himself, in a way, to death, and he knew that was going to happen. The chief priests lost his temper, ripping his clothes. He yelled, "Did you hear that? After that, do we need witnesses? You heard the blasphemy. Are you going to stand for it?" And they condemned him, one and all. The sentence? Death. And they were clever, right? They didn't have the power. They didn't have the authority to kill somebody. They had to get that from the Romans. And so they manipulated the Romans. They manipulated Pilate. They manipulated Herod. And they got what they want, the crucifixion of Jesus. So what does the resurrection mean? What is the serpent that crushes the human spirit? What is it, the snake, that is entwined around the hearts of men and women? What is it that causes us to sin? What is it that has imprisoned our mind? What is it that causes us to distance ourselves from God? Let's go back to Genesis 3. When Adam and Eve ate the fruit from that mythical tree, they took within themselves the knowledge of good and evil. They gained the ability to decide what was right and what was wrong. They gained the ability to judge something and to decide for themselves whether it was good or bad. And what was the first thing they did with this new power? Do you remember the story? Does anyone know the story? They made clothes out of fig leaves. Do you remember? Now, I have a question. How many of you think that Adam suddenly turned round and saw Eve naked and said, "Ugh"? It's funny, right? How many of you think Eve turned around and saw Adam and went, "Oh, put that away"? I don't think so. I don't think so. I know human nature, and I know that's very unlikely. But what they did was they still put on clothes. Why did they put on clothes? Because suddenly they didn't like to be exposed themselves. They wanted to see the other. They didn't want to be seen. They didn't want to be so exposed. They felt dirty. They felt wrong. They felt what we know to be and what we term shame. Shame is described by one researcher as the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed, unworthy of love and belonging. Something we've experienced, something we've done, or something we've failed to do makes us unclean, untouchable, unapproachable, unworthy of connection. I know that you know what it's like to feel shame. But I want to tell you that sometimes we are tempted to feel shame in a lot more simple and less complex ways. According to Genesis, shame is a foundation and source of all human dysfunction, or the first outcome of all human dysfunction. But it's not just the result of big things. It's not just the result of committing a crime or falling into addiction. It's not just the result of doing the wrong thing. Sure, those things can make us feel shame. They can make us feel guilty. But do you know the difference between guilt and shame? Guilt says, I've done the wrong thing. Shame says, I am the wrong thing. Yes? Guilt says, I screwed up. Shame says, I am a screw up. Do you see the difference? I am unworthy, unclean. But it is also in the smaller moments of life. I have friends on Facebook, and I know, surprise, right? And occasionally they post things like from those running apps. Does anyone have running friends on Facebook? How good does it feel when they post that post that says, just completed a 10-kilometer run today in under an hour? Oh man, come on. Doesn't make you feel great, does it? Well, maybe. You don't care. What about your friends when they post something on Facebook, having a great night out, and they post a photo, and you're not there, and you see the photo of them having a great night out, and you suddenly think, well, why didn't they tell me they were going out? I would have liked to have gone. Is there something wrong with me? What am I missing out on? Do you ever feel like that? What about times if you text a friend and they don't immediately text back? Have you ever had that? I occasionally do it, and I just get into this frame of mind. I don't know what it is, and I text Rebecca, and if she doesn't respond within 3 hours, I text her again. Do you ever do that? Those of you who've texted Rebecca, no, it takes 3 hours. No, actually, it doesn't take 3 hours for anybody else, just me. These little things that happen, and so many of them now happen around social media. These little ways that we compare ourselves with what someone else is doing or someone else has done, someone else's achievements, someone else's incredible baking. Where's Brooke? We get tempted to compare ourselves, and it makes us feel, well, not so great, doesn't it? Only in a tiny way. But it can build together. It can compound. I did an experiment the other day. It was Rebecca's birthday. Did you ever know it was Rebecca's birthday on Thursday? Rebecca's my wife, if you don't know. She is the most wonderful and beautiful person. She has taught me so much about who God is and God's unconditional love. But on her birthday, I did not post anything on Facebook. In past years, I have done what is normally done and found some goofy photo from the past and added some soppy words and some horrible hashtags and posted it. And it gets lots of likes. She gets lots of attention from it. But I didn't do it. And then I waited until yesterday. And I said, so, she didn't mention it. I was expecting her to mention it. I was expecting to have a conversation about it so that I could tell you about the conversation this morning. So I had to ask her. I said, how do you feel? She said, oh, no, it's not bad. No. I'm like, do you feel like angry? Were you embarrassed? Did you feel a little bit ashamed? She said, no. I said, why not? She says, well, I've learned not to expect anything. She kind of ruined my experiment. But kind of did it well anyway, right? Because I was very tempted, and I'm still working through the shame. But you see, it's these little interactions, and it's often the little interactions we have with the people we love, the people we trust with our emotions so closely. The people who are most likely to play with us on Facebook and mess with our heads and our minds. We get tempted to feeling that way. And little by little, as time goes on, these things can build up, and we can start to feel unworthy, unclean. But Jesus came. Jesus came. And Jesus came and he preached and he spoke and he taught us about the love of God. He said, I am God. I know what God thinks. I and the Father are one. I am the Son of Man, and I have all the authority, and I'm telling you, God loves you. I'm telling you, God is for you. God in heaven is on your side, he says. And I know that because I am God. I am Son of Man. I am this figure. So by dying on the cross for all humanity, for you and you and you and you and you and you and me, all of us, none of us can say we're unworthy. None of us, because this cross stands as a monument to God's love for us, we can never say, you know what, God must have died for everybody else except me. I'm sorry, you're not that special. You're not on an exclusion list because there isn't one. God dies for all of humanity, no matter what you've done that might make you feel unclean, no matter what you might do that makes you feel unclean, no matter what has happened to you that makes you feel unclean. God has died for you. You are divinely worthy. The resurrection of Jesus proves that he was God, that he has the power, that he has the authority, that he is this Son of Man, that he does love you. He loves you no matter what. So we're going to play this song. And in response this morning, I want to invite you to come and as a reminder, to come and to immerse your hands in water as though a ritual hand washing, if you like. But it's a physical act to remind us that his death on a cross cleanses us of the shame that can entangle our souls. I invite you as the song plays, as we just play this video, to come, to immerse your hands, to wash and to know that you are clean. You are worthy.
The Savior alone carried